May 1st, 1936, New Orleans, Louisiana. It was a warm Friday afternoon on Canal Street. Among the automobiles, streetcars, pedestrians, hotels, shops, and restaurants of one of America's busiest southern cities, federal agents were waiting. They knew the man they were looking for. His face had appeared on wanted posters. His fingerprints were stored in federal files. Investigators had pursued him across the country, and by this point, many of the people who had once surrounded him were gone. Fred Barker was dead. Arthur Barker was in prison. Ma Barker was dead. Other associates had been captured. The criminal organization that had once moved confidently through the Midwest had largely collapsed. But one man remained, Alvin Francis Karpis. To the Bureau of Investigation, Karpis represented unfinished business. For years, he had robbed banks, moved between states, used aliases, participated in kidnappings for enormous ransoms, and repeatedly managed to stay ahead of the authorities pursuing him. Now, federal agents believed they finally knew where he was, and this arrest would be different from most, because among the law enforcement officials waiting in New Orleans that day was the director of the Bureau himself, J. Edgar Hoover. Karpis approached an automobile. Agents moved in. Within moments, one of America's most wanted fugitives was surrounded. There would be no highway escape, no sudden disappearance into another state, no safe house waiting several hundred miles away. After years of pursuit, Alvin Karpis had finally been caught, but almost immediately, another story began, one that would be repeated for decades. According to one famous version of events, the agents had prepared so carefully to capture Karpis that nobody remembered to bring handcuffs. Different accounts would later disagree about exactly what happened. Even the circumstances of Hoover's personal role in the arrest became part of the mythology. But one thing was certain: Alvin Karpis was no longer a fugitive, and the federal government had captured the man it portrayed as its last great public enemy number one of the Depression-era crime wave. Soon, Karpis would be transported away from New Orleans. Eventually, he would be sent to an island in San Francisco Bay. He would arrive at Alcatraz, expecting perhaps to spend the rest of his life there. And remarkably, he would remain on that island for more than a quarter of a century, longer than any other federal prisoner held at Alcatraz. But unlike so many famous criminals of his generation, Alvin Karpis survived. He grew old. He regained his freedom. And years later, he told his own version of the story, a version that challenged one of the most famous legends in American criminal history, the legend of Ma Barker. But before Alcatraz, before the nationwide manhunt, before Fred Barker, and long before J. Edgar Hoover arrived in New Orleans, there was a boy born hundreds of miles north of the United States, in Canada, and his name was not yet Alvin Karpis. Hello, and welcome back to ASMR Crime Chronicles. Tonight, we'll be exploring the life of Alvin Karpis, one of the most notorious criminals of America's Depression-era crime wave, and the man whose name became permanently linked with the Barker-Karpis Gang. As always, this story will be told slowly, quietly, and respectfully. So get comfortable, settle in, and when you're ready, let's begin. Alvin Francis Karpis was born on August 10, 1907, in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. His parents were Lithuanian immigrants. His birth name was Alvin Francis Karpis, the name by which America would eventually know him Alvin Karpis, belonged to the future. His family later moved to the United States, and Karpis spent much of his childhood in Kansas. There was little about those early years to suggest that one day, the director of America's Federal Investigative Agency would personally participate in his arrest. Karpis did not come from a famous criminal family. There was no Barker name surrounding him, no newspapers following his childhood, no mythology. That came later. As a young man, Karpis began getting into trouble. Like Arthur Barker, his transformation into a nationally wanted criminal did not happen overnight. There was no single morning when he suddenly became a gangster. Instead, there was progression, petty crime, associations, arrests, prison, more serious crime, and increasingly, a life lived outside conventional society. By his late teens, Karpis had accumulated enough trouble to enter the prison system. That experience would change his life, because prisons do more than confine criminals. They also introduce them to one another. And during the 1920s and early 1930s, those relationships could eventually stretch across entire states. Kansas State Penitentiary stood in Lansing, not far from Kansas City. Behind its walls were men convicted of crimes ranging from relatively minor offenses to robbery and murder. For a young offender, prison could function as an education of a very different kind. A person entered knowing a handful of local criminals. He could leave knowing people from across the region, names, reputations, techniques, contacts. Which men could be trusted, which could not. Who knew how to open a safe? Who could obtain an automobile? Who knew where stolen goods could be sold? Who might provide a place to hide? Those connections mattered because the criminal world of the 1930s would increasingly depend upon networks. Karpis eventually escaped from custody in 1930. He was now a fugitive, and that changed the nature of his life. Ordinary stability became dangerous. A permanent home created an address investigators could watch. A regular job created records. Long-term acquaintances could be questioned. Remaining in one location increased the possibility of recognition. So movement became protection, and America was becoming an increasingly easy country through which to move. Automobiles had transformed the landscape. Road networks connected towns that only a generation earlier had seemed distant. A criminal could rob a business, get into a powerful car, and cross a county line before local authorities had organized a response. Cross another line, and another, and suddenly the investigation involved several jurisdictions. Police departments did not share information instantly. There were no computerized databases, no nationwide digital surveillance systems, no mobile phones broadcasting locations. A fugitive carrying cash and using a false name could sometimes disappear remarkably effectively. Karpis learned to live in that world. He used aliases, moved frequently, and developed relationships with other criminals. Then, one of those relationships changed everything. Inside the Kansas prison system, Karpis became acquainted with another young criminal. His name was Fred Barker. Fred came from a family already well acquainted with law enforcement. His brothers Herman, Lloyd, and Arthur had accumulated criminal histories of their own. His mother, Kate, remained intensely loyal to her sons. Fred was the youngest Barker brother, and over time, he would become perhaps the most important criminal partner of Alvin Karpis's life. Their personalities appear to have complemented one another. Fred had a reputation for toughness. Karpis developed a reputation for intelligence and planning. Neither man alone created the organization that would eventually bear their names, but together they formed its core. When Karpis and Fred were both back outside prison, their partnership continued. This is an important point. The Barker-Karpis Gang was not simply the Barker family committing crimes together, nor was it necessarily a rigid organization with a permanent membership. It was closer to a network. Fred Barker, Alvin Karpis, Arthur Barker at various points, experienced robbers, drivers, safecrackers, people who provided information, people who arranged hideouts, people who participated in one operation and disappeared before the next. That flexibility made the organization effective. It also made it difficult to investigate. There was no single membership list for police to discover, no headquarters, no permanent address. The gang existed wherever its members happened to be. And then there was Kate Barker, Ma Barker. Karpis's later recollections of her would become extremely important, because the woman described in his memoirs bore little resemblance to the criminal mastermind portrayed in newspapers and popular culture. Karpis did not deny that Kate traveled with her sons. He did not portray her as ignorant of the kind of lives they were leading, but he strongly disputed the idea that she directed their criminal operations. According to Karpis, the gang did not involve her in planning its major crimes. That testimony came decades later and has to be considered as the recollection of a participant with his own perspective. But it remains one of the most important challenges to the traditional Ma Barker legend. And because this is Alvin's story, we'll eventually hear much more about what he said. For now, the gang's ambitions were still developing. Bank robbery became increasingly important. Banks offered cash, but they also offered danger. A successful robbery required speed, planning, transportation, and discipline. The men needed to understand the layout. They needed to know when money would be available. They needed vehicles capable of outrunning police, and they needed somewhere to go afterward. This was not necessarily the spontaneous world depicted in gangster movies. The most successful operations could involve days or weeks of preparation. The automobile became one of the gang's most important tools. Cars could be stolen well before a robbery. License plates could be changed. One vehicle could be abandoned, and another used for the next stage of an escape. Routes could be selected to cross jurisdictional boundaries. A criminal gang that understood roads could sometimes move faster than information about the crime. Karpis became particularly associated with that mobile style of criminal life. Never remain comfortable for too long. Never assume a hideout is permanent. Never assume the police are as far behind as you hope. Keep moving. But movement had consequences. It required money, contacts, safe places, and trust. Every additional person who knew where the gang was staying became a possible source of information. Every stolen automobile could be traced. Every hotel registration could create a record. Every telephone call might eventually matter. Every fingerprint could survive long after the gang had gone. The criminals were becoming more sophisticated. So were the people pursuing them. By the early 1930s, America was entering the period later remembered as the Public Enemy era. The Great Depression had devastated the economy. Millions were unemployed. Banks had collapsed. Families had lost savings. Against that background, A group of interstate criminals became national celebrities. John Dillinger, Charles Pretty Boy Floyd, George Machine Gun Kelly, Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, George Babyface Nelson, and eventually Alvin Karpis. Newspapers transformed their movements into serialized drama. A robbery in one state became national news. A prison escape became front-page material. A photograph could turn an obscure criminal into a face recognized across America. Some members of the public romanticized the outlaws, but behind that mythology, real people were being robbed, kidnapped, and killed. The newspaper legend and the reality were not the same thing. Federal law enforcement was changing rapidly in response. J. Edgar Hoover had become director of the Bureau of Investigation in 1924. He pushed the organization towards centralized records, professionalized agents, fingerprint identification, and increasingly sophisticated investigative techniques. For years, federal agents had comparatively limited authority over many ordinary crimes. A local robbery remained primarily a local matter, but interstate crime created opportunities for federal involvement, and Congress was gradually expanding federal jurisdiction. Then came the Lindbergh kidnapping in 1932. The kidnapping and death of Charles Lindbergh's young son horrified the country. Public pressure for stronger federal action intensified. The Federal Kidnapping Act expanded the government's ability to pursue kidnappers who transported victims across state lines. That law would become extremely important to Alvin Karpis because the Barker-Karpis Gang was about to make a decision that transformed it from a successful regional criminal network into a national federal priority. Robbery could produce thousands of dollars. Kidnapping could produce much more. A wealthy victim might be worth tens of thousands, perhaps 100,000, perhaps even more. But kidnapping was different from robbery. A robbery could be over in minutes. A kidnapping might continue for days or weeks. The victim had to be guarded. Food had to be provided. A hiding place had to remain secure. Ransom messages had to be delivered. Money had to be collected. The victim had to be released without leading police directly back to the gang. Every additional hour created risk. Every additional participant created risk. Every piece of paper created risk. And every time someone touched that paper, they could leave something behind. In 1933, Karpis and his associates turned their attention towards St. Paul, Minnesota. The city had long possessed a peculiar reputation within the criminal underworld. For years, certain criminals had regarded St. Paul as a relatively safe place to hide, associated with an informal arrangement under which fugitives could supposedly avoid local interference, provided they refrained from committing crimes within the city. Whatever the exact reality of that arrangement, St. Paul's reputation as a haven for criminals became legendary, but the Barker-Karpis Gang was about to violate the most important principle behind that supposed protection. They were going to commit a major crime in St. Paul itself. Their target was a wealthy businessman, the president of the Theodore Hamm Brewing Company, a man whose routine could be observed, a man whose family could afford an enormous ransom. His name was William Hamm Jr. On June 15, 1933, Hamm left his office. He expected to go home. Instead, he disappeared, and Alvin Karpis was about to enter an entirely different category of American criminal history. By the beginning of the 1930s, Alvin Karpis had found something that many criminals never did, a partnership that worked. His association with Fred Barker would become the foundation of one of the most notorious criminal organizations of the Depression era. But the Barker-Karpis Gang did not suddenly appear, fully formed. It developed, one relationship at a time, one robbery at a time, one associate at a time, and behind it all was the constant necessity of staying ahead of the police. Fred Barker was younger than Karpis, but by the time the two men began operating together, Fred already possessed considerable experience with crime. The Barker family had been dealing with police, courts, and prisons for years. His brothers had criminal records. Arthur Barker, whom we explored in our previous episode, had already spent a significant portion of his young adulthood incarcerated. Fred's own history was becoming increasingly serious. Karpis later remembered him as an unusually close partner. That matters, because criminal organizations are built on trust, and trust among fugitives is difficult. Everyone has something to lose. An arrested associate might cooperate with police. A disgruntled accomplice might reveal a hideout. A careless friend might mention something to the wrong person. Even family members could become liabilities. Karpis and Fred nevertheless developed a partnership that survived years of robberies, manhunts, and life on the run. Karpis would later describe Fred as one of the few men he genuinely trusted. Their roles were not necessarily identical. Karpis acquired a reputation as thoughtful, patient, and calculating. Fred was often characterized as more forceful. Together, they made an effective combination, but describing Karpis as the brains and Fred as merely the muscle would oversimplify things. Both men participated in planning. Both understood the necessity of preparation, and both knew that surviving a robbery depended just as much on what happened before and after the crime as on the robbery itself. The name Barker-Karpis Gang can create a misleading picture. It sounds like a fixed organization, a permanent collection of criminals who committed every crime together. The reality was much less tidy. The gang functioned more like a network. At its center were Karpis and Fred Barker. Around them moved a changing collection of associates. Some participated in robberies. Some provided automobiles. Some knew how to handle explosives or safes. Some offered information. Others helped arrange hideouts. Arthur Barker became involved after his release from prison. Different men appeared during different stages of the gang's history. That flexibility provided protection. If police identified one participant, they still might not know everyone else. If one safe house became dangerous, another could be found. If pressure increased in one state, the gang could move elsewhere. They were not tied to a neighborhood or even a city. Their territory was the road. One city became especially important, St. Paul, Minnesota, during the late 1920s and early 1930s. St. Paul developed an extraordinary reputation within the American underworld. Criminals from elsewhere reportedly regarded the city as a place where they could hide with comparatively little interference from local police, provided they followed an unwritten rule: do not commit crimes in St. Paul. The arrangement became associated with Police Chief John O'Connor and is often called the O'Connor system. The exact workings of the system and how consistently it operated remain subjects of historical discussion, but St. Paul's reputation as a haven for fugitives was real enough to attract some remarkable visitors. gangsters could stay in hotels, rent apartments, meet associates, rest between crimes, then leave the city to commit robberies elsewhere. For men living constantly on the move, a place where they could temporarily relax was enormously valuable. Karpis and the Barkers made use of that environment. But there was an obvious contradiction. St. Paul also contained wealthy people, business owners, bankers, executives, families with money, potential targets, and eventually, the temptation became too great. The criminals who had benefited from St. Paul's reputation as a sanctuary would begin committing major crimes there. That decision helped destroy the very protection they had relied upon. The romantic image of a Depression-era gangster often involves expensive suits, fast cars, hotels, and stacks of cash. The reality of being a fugitive was far less comfortable. Karpis had to think constantly about recognition. Where could he sleep? Who knew his real name? Was someone watching the building? Had a photograph appeared in the newspaper? Was a particular automobile now known to police? Could an acquaintance be trusted? Was it time to leave? Life became temporary. Temporary rooms, temporary houses, temporary names, temporary cars. A fugitive could rarely become too attached to anything because anything familiar could become evidence. Karpis became skilled at using aliases. That was hardly unusual. Aliases were basic tools of the criminal world. A false name could be used at a hotel, on a rental agreement, during an introduction. But the effectiveness of an alias depended upon one important thing. Law enforcement had to rely on the name. Increasingly, it did not. Fingerprint identification was becoming more sophisticated. Photographs could be circulated nationally. Criminal records were becoming more centralized. The Bureau of Investigation maintained an enormous fingerprint collection. Karpis could change his name. He could not change his fingerprints. Before kidnapping made the Barker-Karpis Gang nationally infamous, robbery was central to its operations. Banks offered obvious rewards, but they also created enormous risks. The gang could not simply walk into an unfamiliar bank and hope everything worked. Successful robberies required observation. The surrounding streets mattered. The location of the police station mattered. The timing mattered. The getaway route mattered. Even the terrain beyond the town mattered. The men could study a target beforehand. They could determine where employees entered, when customers were most likely to appear, where automobiles could be positioned, and which roads offered the quickest route away. A second vehicle might be placed somewhere else, allowing the gang to abandon the first. By the time police identified one car, the men could already be traveling in another. Yet no amount of preparation eliminated danger. Bank robberies could become chaotic. Witnesses behaved unpredictably. Police might arrive sooner than expected. A vehicle might fail. Someone might recognize a participant. And every robbery created new evidence. The gang, therefore, had to keep moving. Karpis learned that survival depended upon discipline. One successful crime did not mean the next would succeed. One safe hideout did not remain safe forever. And one trusted associate could eventually become the person who led police directly to you. During this period, Kate Barker remained part of the world surrounding her sons. This is where Karpis's account becomes particularly interesting. Popular culture would later portray Ma Barker sitting at the center of the organization, directing her sons and their associates. Karpis remembered something very different. He portrayed Kate as fiercely devoted to her sons. but not as the architect of the gang's crimes. According to his later account, detailed criminal discussions were generally kept away from her. That does not mean she knew nothing. It would have been difficult to live around wanted criminals without understanding that something was happening. But knowing your sons are criminals and planning their kidnappings are very different things. Karpis believed the second image was largely mythology. There was also a practical reason Kate might travel with the gang. An older woman accompanying younger men could make a rented house appear more ordinary. A group of unattached men arriving in a small community might attract attention. A household that appeared to contain a mother and her adult sons could seem less unusual. Whether Kate consciously understood herself as providing cover is another question, but her presence could help create the appearance of domestic normality behind the curtains. The situation was anything but normal. As Karpis and Fred became more established, their network widened. The Midwest criminal underworld was surprisingly interconnected. Prisons created introductions, speakeasies and nightclubs created others. Professional criminals knew one another by reputation. A person who needed a skilled accomplice might know someone who knew someone else. In that sense, the criminal world functioned almost like an informal employment network, except every connection carried risk. One associate might be dependable, another might panic, another might spend money too visibly, another might talk after arrest. Karpis needed people, but every person he brought closer made the organization more vulnerable, and law enforcement understood this. Investigators did not always need to find the fugitive directly. Sometimes they could find the people around him, a girlfriend, a former cellmate, a relative, a landlord, a mechanic, a person who rented a garage. Watch enough connections, and eventually the fugitive might appear. This method would become increasingly important as federal investigators closed in on the public enemy gangs. Karpis spent years attempting to remain one step ahead of that process. Meanwhile, the country around him was changing. The Great Depression continued. Millions of Americans struggled economically. Bank failures had devastated communities, and public attitudes toward bank robbers could sometimes become strangely complicated. Some people resented financial institutions so deeply that criminals who robbed banks acquired a distorted kind of folk hero reputation. Newspapers contributed to the mythology. Nicknames helped. Photographs helped. Stories of spectacular escapes helped. But the people actually encountering these gangs saw something very different. Employees threatened during robberies, families terrified by kidnappings, police officers trying to stop armed fugitives. Communities suddenly transformed into crime scenes. The mythology made gangsters entertaining. The reality made them dangerous. Karpis understood the value of publicity, but he also understood its danger. A famous criminal is a recognizable criminal. By 1933, Karpis and Fred Barker had become experienced interstate offenders. They had contacts, mobility, planning ability, and confidence. But robbery had limitations. Even a successful bank robbery might produce less money than expected. The gang needed multiple robberies to maintain its lifestyle. Each one created another opportunity for capture. There was another way to obtain a much larger amount of money from a single operation: kidnapping. Kidnapping for ransom was not new, but during the early 1930s, several spectacular cases transformed it into a national obsession. The Lindbergh kidnapping had demonstrated how completely one abduction could capture America's attention. It had also helped bring federal authorities much more deeply into kidnapping investigations. Karpis and his associates knew the potential reward. They also understood at least some of the danger. A wealthy businessman could be worth far more than the contents of a bank vault. But unlike money, a kidnapped person had to be hidden, fed, guarded, moved, and eventually released. The ransom had to be collected. Messages had to be delivered. Every stage created evidence. Still, the potential payoff was enormous, and the gang decided to take the risk. They looked towards St. Paul, the very city whose underworld reputation had helped protect criminals like them. Their target was William Hamm Jr., president of the Theodore Hamm Brewing Company. Hamm was wealthy, prominent, and predictable enough to observe. The gang began preparing. This would not be another quick robbery. They would need a location to hold him, a method of communicating with his family, a ransom demand, a way to collect the money, and a plan for releasing Hamm without being caught. Most importantly, they needed secrecy, because once William Hamm disappeared, local police would not be the only people looking for him. The federal government would become involved. On June 15, 1933, William Hamm left the brewery. The distance between his workplace and his home was short, a journey he had made many times, but this time, men were waiting. Hamm was intercepted, forced into an automobile, and driven away. The Barker-Karpis Gang had crossed a line. Bank robbery had made Alvin Karpis a criminal. Kidnapping would help make him nationally infamous. And although the gang did not realize it yet, somewhere among the papers connected to the crime, they were leaving behind evidence that could identify them. Not a witness, not a confession, something much smaller, a fingerprint. June 15, 1933, St. Paul, Minnesota. William Hamm Jr. left the offices of his family's brewery and began the short journey toward home. It was familiar, ordinary, a route he had traveled many times before. But on this particular afternoon, he was being watched. Men associated with the Barker-Karpis Gang had selected Hamm for a reason. He was wealthy. His family owned the Theodore Hamm Brewing Company. He followed routines that could be studied, and perhaps most importantly, his family could afford to pay. The gang had robbed banks before, but this was something very different. They were no longer taking money from a vault. They were taking a person and assigning a price to his return. That price was $100,000. Hamm was intercepted not far from the brewery. The kidnappers forced him into an automobile. Then they drove. The details of what followed were designed to disorient him. A kidnapping victim could become a witness the moment he was released. If Hamm could identify roads, buildings, landmarks, or the location where he had been held, he might lead investigators directly back to the gang. So the kidnappers tried to control what he could perceive. The journey continued away from St. Paul and eventually across state lines. That was a critical decision because once Hamm was transported interstate, the federal government's authority to pursue the kidnappers became much stronger. The gang was no longer simply challenging local police. It was challenging the Bureau of Investigation. For Karpis, this operation required a kind of discipline different from robbery. A bank robbery happened quickly. Minutes might separate entering the building. From racing away, kidnapping moved at another pace. hours became days. The victim had to remain somewhere. Someone had to guard him. Communication had to continue. The family had to understand the ransom instructions. And everyone involved had to resist the temptation to make an unnecessary move. Every hour increased the possibility of discovery. The ransom demand was enormous. $100,000 in 1933. At a time when the United States was still struggling through the depths of the Great Depression. The amount was staggering for the gang. That was the attraction. A successful bank robbery might require enormous risk for a comparatively uncertain return. Kidnapping one wealthy businessman could potentially produce more money than several robberies combined. But there was a problem. The Hamm family needed to believe that the kidnappers actually had William, and the gang needed a way to communicate its demands. That meant paper. Ransom notes were prepared, instructions were given, and Hamm himself was required to sign documents associated with the ransom demand. The gang appears to have believed these papers would help establish that Hamm was alive and genuinely being held. In that sense, the documents served their purpose, but they served another purpose too, one the kidnappers never intended. Because while the men were thinking about words, investigators would eventually become interested in what had been left on the paper itself. For Karpis and his associates, collecting the ransom may have been the most dangerous part of the operation. The family could prepare the money, the gang could issue instructions, but eventually, the two sides had to intersect. Somebody had to retrieve the cash. That created vulnerability. Police could watch roads. Federal agents could observe possible exchange points. The ransom bills could be recorded. A vehicle could be identified. A participant could be recognized. The kidnappers therefore needed the exchange to happen quickly and on their terms. The Hamm family ultimately complied. The ransom was paid, and after several days in captivity, William Hamm was released alive to the gang. The result must have looked extraordinary. They had taken one of St. Paul's most prominent businessmen, demanded $100,000, received the money, released their victim, and remained free. No one had been waiting outside the hideout to arrest them. No roadblock had ended their escape. No immediate raid followed. They had done it, and success can be dangerous, because success does not merely provide money, it provides confidence. While the gang concentrated on the ransom, federal investigators concentrated on the evidence. The Bureau received documents connected with the kidnapping. The paper did not appear especially remarkable, but investigators believed the kidnappers might have left latent fingerprints behind. Fingerprints on paper were difficult to develop using conventional methods. The porous surface absorbed perspiration. Ordinary fingerprint powder was often ineffective. Investigators therefore used a chemical technique involving silver nitrate. The process could react with chloride residues left behind when human hands touched paper. After treatment and exposure, patterns invisible before could emerge. Loops, whorls, ridges, fingerprints. And on evidence connected with the Hamm kidnapping, investigators found them. The kidnappers had spent considerable effort hiding their identities. They used automobiles. They moved Hamm. They controlled what he could see. They planned the ransom exchange. They relied upon aliases and criminal contacts. Yet the smallest physical interaction, touching a piece of paper, had preserved identifying evidence. That contrast is one of the remarkable things about the case. The gang understood the weaknesses of 1930s policing, but forensic science was advancing beneath them. Karpis had already encountered the criminal justice system. So had Fred Barker. So had Arthur Barker. Their fingerprints existed in official records, and a fingerprint does not depend upon a witness remembering a face. It does not care which alias someone uses. It does not disappear because a suspect crosses into another state. If investigators could match a latent print, they could connect a person to evidence without ever having seen him commit the crime. The Hamm case became an important demonstration of that emerging power. The gang did not immediately collapse. Quite the opposite. Karpis remained free. Fred Barker remained free. Arthur Barker remained free. The ransom money was theirs. From their perspective, the operation had succeeded, but the success contained a hidden cost. Evidence was now sitting in federal files. Evidence did not need to catch them immediately to be dangerous. It could wait. A fingerprint could remain relevant months later. An automobile description could become meaningful after another crime. A name that seemed unimportant today could connect two investigations tomorrow. Investigators were learning about the gang, even when the gang did not realize it. And there was another consequence. The kidnapping had broken the supposed understanding that helped make St. Paul attractive to criminals. The gang had committed a major crime against a prominent citizen in the very city fugitives had treated as a refuge. That could not continue without consequences. Public pressure increased. The old relationships between criminals and corrupt or accommodating officials became harder to maintain. The underworld sanctuary was becoming less secure. Karpis and his associates had gained $100,000, but they had helped destroy something potentially even more valuable, a place to hide. The gang needed to handle the money carefully. Large amounts of ransom cash created a peculiar problem. Money was useful only if it could be spent, but investigators could record serial numbers before a ransom was delivered. That meant an ordinary transaction could become a clue. A bill handed across a counter, deposited at a bank, or exchanged somewhere far from the kidnapping could potentially reveal where the ransom money had traveled. The criminals therefore needed patience. They could not necessarily begin spending conspicuously. Once again, the proceeds of the crime created their own risk. For a time, the gang continued moving, different locations, different names, different automobiles. Karpis and Fred remained at the center of the network, and if the Hamm kidnapping had frightened them away from kidnapping, the story might have developed very differently. Instead, it appears to have convinced them that the method worked. They had demanded $100,000. They had received it. Their victim survived, and they remained free. So the next question was obvious. Could they do it again? And if they could, why ask for the same amount? 7 months passed. January 1934. St. Paul. The city had not forgotten William Hamm. Federal investigators had not forgotten him either. But Karpis and his associates were preparing another operation. Their next target was not a brewer. He was a banker. Edward G. Bremer. Bremer came from another prominent St. Paul family. His father had financial resources and political connections. This time, the gang's ransom demand would not be $100,000. It would be $200,000, twice as much. The ambition of the Barker-Karpis gang had grown dramatically in less than a year, but so had the danger, because the Hamm kidnapping had already given investigators evidence. The second kidnapping would give them more, and when evidence from separate crimes begins pointing toward the same people, a criminal organization can suddenly discover that the past has been following it all along. On the morning of January 17th, 1934, Edward Bremer drove his daughter to school. Afterward, he continued on alone, somewhere along his route. The gang was waiting, and this time, the kidnapping would not unfold as smoothly as the first. The victim would be held much longer. The ransom would be larger. The investigation would reach the highest levels of government, and for Alvin Karpis, the comfortable distance between fugitive and pursuer would begin to disappear. January 17th, 1934, St. Paul, Minnesota. 7 months had passed since the kidnapping of William Hamm. The Barker-Karpis gang had demanded $100,000, collected the ransom, released Hamm alive, and escaped immediate capture for Alvin Karpis and Fred Barker. The lesson could have seemed obvious. Kidnapping worked, but there was another lesson, one they had apparently failed to appreciate. The federal government was still investigating. Evidence from the Hamm case had not disappeared simply because the newspapers had moved on. Fingerprints remained in files. Names remained on reports. Investigators continued comparing information, and when the gang decided to strike again, they gave those investigators something enormously valuable, a second case. Their new target was Edward G. Bremer. Bremer was a banker. He came from a wealthy and influential St. Paul family. His father, Adolf Bremer, had extensive business interests and political connections. The family could afford a substantial ransom, and after what had happened to William Hamm, the gang had reason to believe another wealthy St. Paul family might comply. But this time, they wanted more, much more. The demand would be $200,000, twice the Hamm ransom. It was an extraordinary escalation, and it reveals something about the gang's confidence. They were no longer experimenting with kidnapping. They believed they understood it. They had done it before. They had been paid. They had remained free. Now, they intended to do it again. On January 17th, Bremer began his morning much as he normally did. He drove his young daughter to school. After dropping her off, he continued alone. The gang had studied his movements. They knew where he was likely to be, and somewhere along his route, they intercepted him. The kidnapping did not proceed as smoothly as Hamm's had. Bremer resisted. There was a confrontation. He was injured during the abduction, but the kidnappers succeeded in forcing him away from his automobile and into their control. Later, Bremer's abandoned car would provide investigators with a physical location connected directly to the crime, and unlike a newspaper description, a physical crime scene could be examined carefully. For Karpis and the gang, experience offered advantages. They already understood the broad mechanics of kidnapping: hold a victim, communicate with the family, demand money, arrange the exchange, release the victim, disappear. But repeating a crime creates a different kind of danger. Comparison. Investigators could place the Hamm and Bremer files side by side. What was similar? What was different? Were the ransom communications constructed in comparable ways? Did the kidnappers use similar methods? Did the same names appear around both investigations? Were there overlapping criminal associates? Could forensic evidence connect one case to the other? A single kidnapping might contain mysteries. Two kidnappings could begin answering each other's questions. Bremer's captivity lasted considerably longer than Hamm's. Days passed, then weeks, for the gang. That meant maintaining control over an increasingly complicated situation. Every additional day required food, guarding, communication, secrecy, and patience. The victim could remember voices, conversations, sounds, the length of automobile journeys, changes in road surfaces, the environment surrounding the hideout, a train whistle in the distance, a dog barking nearby. Anything repeated often enough might later become meaningful. Kidnappers could control what a captive saw. They could not necessarily control everything he heard or remembered. Karpis and his associates therefore faced a strange problem. Bremer was their most valuable asset. He was also their most dangerous witness. They needed him alive if they expected the family to pay. But the longer he remained with them, the more information he might accumulate. Meanwhile, the Bremer family received the ransom demand, $200,000, during the Great Depression. The figure was almost difficult to comprehend. The family began arranging payment. Federal investigators became deeply involved, and the case attracted attention far beyond Minnesota. Adolf Bremer had connections to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The kidnapping therefore carried political significance as well as criminal significance. Federal authorities were under pressure. The Barker-Karpis Gang had already kidnapped one prominent St. Paul businessman. Now, less than a year later, another had vanished. If the same organization was responsible, then investigators were no longer confronting an isolated crime. They were confronting a criminal enterprise that apparently believed it could kidnap wealthy Americans repeatedly and get away with it. Preparing a ransom presented investigators with an opportunity. The serial numbers of bills could be recorded. The kidnappers might successfully collect the money, but that did not make the cash invisible. Every bill spent afterward carried a number. If one appeared at a bank, a store, a hotel, or another business, investigators might be able to trace where it had come from. That created a frustrating paradox for the gang. They wanted cash precisely because it was portable, anonymous, difficult to trace. But ransom cash could be different. The more money they obtained, the more evidence they might be carrying with them. The ransom was eventually delivered. The gang had achieved the central objective of the operation, $200,000, but the victim was still in their custody, and until Bremer was safely released, the crime was not finished. On February 7, 1934, approximately 3 weeks after his abduction, Edward Bremer was released. He was alive. For his family, the nightmare had ended. For Karpis, another kidnapping appeared to have succeeded. The gang had now collected roughly $300,000 from 2 major kidnappings in less than a year. They remained free. From a purely criminal perspective, the results were remarkable, but there was a difference between escaping arrest and escaping identification. The gang did not yet fully appreciate that distinction. Now, investigators could interview the victim. Bremer could describe what he remembered, the automobile journeys, his captors, sounds, conversations, details of his confinement. Even information that seemed insignificant could be compared with other evidence. His car could be examined. The ransom communications could be studied. The money could be traced. And the entire case could be compared against the Hamm investigation. The Bureau was no longer starting from nothing. It already had a file. Now, that file was getting thicker. Investigators started connecting people. One name led to another. A known criminal led to an associate. An associate led to an address. An address led to a vehicle. A vehicle led somewhere else. This is where Karpis's greatest strength became one of his greatest weaknesses. His criminal network had helped him survive. He knew people who could provide houses, cars, information, introductions, assistance. But a network can be followed in both directions. Police did not necessarily need to find Alvin Karpis. They needed to find someone who could lead them closer to Alvin Karpis. The same applied to Fred Barker and Arthur Barker and other associates. Every relationship created another line on the investigator's map. The gang could change cars, change cities, change names, but it was much harder to change everyone they knew. Then, some of the money began resurfacing. A ransom bill used in an ordinary transaction might seem meaningless to the person receiving it, but eventually, the serial number could attract attention. Investigators could work backward. Where had the bill been spent? Who had possessed it? Who was nearby? Did that person know someone connected to the gang? Tracing ransom money was painstaking. There was no computer instantly searching every transaction in America. Information moved slowly. Banks and businesses had to cooperate. Records had to be checked. Agents had to interview people. But the process did not need to be fast. It only needed to produce one useful connection, then another, then another. Karpis understood that pressure was increasing. Remaining in one place for too long became dangerous. So the gang returned to what it knew best: movement. Cities became temporary. Houses became temporary. Automobiles became temporary. Names became temporary. But the country itself was becoming less forgiving. Federal agents could follow leads across state boundaries. Fingerprint files connected criminal records. Photographs circulated. Police departments received wanted information, and newspapers placed fugitive faces before millions of readers. The advantage criminals had enjoyed only a few years earlier was shrinking. The two kidnappings also contributed to a transformation inside St. Paul. The city's reputation as a sanctuary for criminals became politically intolerable. Public outrage grew. Federal scrutiny increased. The old system that had supposedly allowed fugitives to remain in the city so long as they behaved themselves could hardly survive when those same fugitives began kidnapping prominent residents. The refuge was closing. For Karpis, that meant one more safe place disappearing from the map. The Barker-Karpis Gang was becoming famous, but fame is dangerous for a fugitive. A criminal whose name is unknown can sit in a restaurant, walk through a hotel lobby, rent a room, buy gasoline, speak to strangers. A famous fugitive must wonder, does that person recognize me? Has my photograph been in the newspaper here? Is the clerk looking at me too closely? Did someone notice the license plate? Every ordinary interaction becomes a possible threat. Karpis had spent years developing the ability to disappear. Now, the country was learning his face, and federal authorities were learning something else. The gang was not invincible. The kidnappers left fingerprints. They spent ransom money. They maintained relationships. They needed houses. They needed automobiles. They needed food. They needed gasoline. They needed people. Every need created exposure. The investigation did not require one brilliant discovery. It required persistence. By late 1934, the balance was changing. Karpis was still free. Fred Barker was still free. Arthur Barker was still free. Ma Barker remained close to her sons. But federal agents were assembling a picture of the organization. They knew more names, more aliases, more associates, more habits, more connections. And once investigators understood the network, they could begin attacking it from the edges. Watch an associate, follow a relative, trace a car, examine an address, wait. Eventually, someone makes a mistake. That mistake would not initially come from Alvin Karpis. It would come from Arthur Barker. January 1935, Chicago, federal agents located Arthur. They arrested him, and among the information recovered after his capture, investigators found a clue pointing south, far south, to Florida, to a quiet house near a lake. Arthur Barker's arrest was about to bring federal agents directly to Fred Barker and Ma Barker. For Alvin Karpis, the gang that had seemed so powerful only months earlier was about to begin collapsing around him, and soon he would discover what it meant to be almost completely alone with the federal government hunting him. January 1935. For more than a year, Alvin Karpis and the Barker brothers had remained ahead of an enormous investigation. They had crossed state lines, changed automobiles, used aliases, moved between hideouts, relied upon criminal associates, and repeatedly disappeared before investigators could reach them. But the distance between the gang and the federal agents pursuing it was narrowing. Evidence from the Hamm kidnapping remained. Evidence from the Bremer kidnapping remained. Ransom money had circulated. Fingerprints had been identified. Associates were being investigated. The network that once protected Karpis and the Barkers was slowly becoming a map that investigators could follow. Then, in January of 1935, the map suddenly led somewhere. January 8th, Chicago. Federal agents arrested Arthur "Doc" Barker. For Arthur, the arrest marked the beginning of the final phase of his life. He would be convicted in connection with the Bremer kidnapping, sent to Alcatraz, and 4 years later, die following an attempted escape from the island. But Arthur's arrest had immediate consequences for Alvin Karpis, because investigators recovered information among Arthur's belongings that helped point them toward Florida, more specifically, towards the Lake Weir area in Central Florida, and federal agents knew exactly whom they hoped to find there. Fred Barker, for Karpis. Fred was more than another member of the gang. He was his closest criminal partner. They had known one another since their prison days. They had committed crimes together, hidden together, traveled together, planned together, and survived together. The organization historians would later call the Barker-Karpis Gang had largely been built around their partnership. If Fred disappeared, the gang would not simply lose a member. Karpis would lose the person at its center with him. Federal investigators followed the Florida lead near Lake Weir. They located a house occupied by Fred Barker and his mother, Kate Ma Barker, in the early hours of January 16, 1935. Agents surrounded the property. What followed was a lengthy confrontation. By the time it ended, Fred Barker and Kate Barker were dead. The news spread rapidly. Newspapers across the country reported the deaths, and almost immediately, the legend of Ma Barker grew larger. Federal authorities portrayed Kate as an important figure within the gang. Popular accounts soon transformed her into something even more dramatic: the criminal matriarch, the mastermind, the woman supposedly directing her son's crimes. It was an extraordinary image, and decades later, Alvin Karpis would strongly challenge it. He would insist that Kate was not the strategic leader portrayed by authorities and newspapers. According to Karpis, she traveled with her sons, enjoyed the benefits of their money, and certainly knew they were criminals. But she was not sitting around a table planning kidnappings and bank robberies. Whether every aspect of Karpis's later recollection should be accepted without question is another matter. He was a participant, writing years afterward with his own perspective. But his testimony remained central to the historical debate over Ma Barker, and Karpis had something most later storytellers did not. He had actually lived with the family. Karpis's description of Fred was very different. Fred, in his telling, was unquestionably part of the gang's criminal core, and his death was devastating to the organization. Arthur was in custody. Fred was dead. Kate was dead. Other associates were being identified or pursued in the space of barely more than a week. The structure surrounding Karpis had changed dramatically. January 8th, Arthur captured. January 16th, Fred and Kate killed. 8 days. That was all it took. Imagine the position Karpis now occupied for years. Survival had depended upon relationships. A person who knew where to find a car, another who could arrange a room, someone who could provide information, someone who could be trusted with money, someone who could participate in a robbery. Fred Barker had been at the center of that world. Now, Fred was gone, and every surviving associate represented a question. Had investigators found them? Were they being watched? Had someone talked? Was a familiar address still safe? Was an old telephone number dangerous? Could anyone still be trusted? The network that had once created security could now lead investigators directly to Karpis. It would be tempting to imagine that Karpis simply disappeared after Fred's death. He did not. He remained involved with other criminals. He continued moving, and he remained dangerous in the eyes of federal authorities. But something fundamental had changed. There would never again be a Barker-Karpis gang in quite the same sense. The partnership that gave the organization its name was over. Karpis had become something different, a fugitive surviving after the collapse of his gang. This is where his story separates sharply from Arthur's. Arthur was captured before the Florida confrontation. His future became a story of prosecution, prison, Alcatraz, and escape. Karpis remained outside. Every day he remained free. The pursuit continued, and every time another famous Depression-era criminal disappeared from the headlines, Karpis became more conspicuous. The criminal landscape of America was changing with astonishing speed. Only a short time earlier, newspapers had been filled with names that seemed almost impossible for law enforcement to contain. John Dillinger, Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, Charles Pretty Boy Floyd, George Babyface Nelson. The names became famous. The photographs became recognizable. Their movements became national news. But one by one, they disappeared. Bonnie and Clyde were killed in Louisiana in May 1934. Dillinger was killed outside Chicago's Biograph Theater in July. Pretty Boy Floyd died in Ohio in October. Babyface Nelson died after a confrontation with federal agents in November. Within months, much of the famous outlaw world of the early Depression had vanished, And Karpis was still alive, still free, still moving. That created an uncomfortable reality for the Bureau. Every day, Karpis remained at large. He represented unfinished business. The federal government had spent years building a new image of national law enforcement: professional, scientific, modern, capable of crossing jurisdictional boundaries that had once protected interstate criminals. The Bureau had expanded its fingerprint files, improved communication, developed a national investigative reach. Its agents had pursued some of America's most notorious fugitives. Yet Alvin Karpis remained outside their custody. The longer he remained free, the more embarrassing that became. The phrase, public enemy number one, is deeply associated with this era, but it can be misleading. It was not always a neat, formal ranking system in which the government maintained an official numbered list exactly as popular culture later imagined. The phrase functioned partly through newspapers, publicity, and law enforcement rhetoric. Still, by the mid-1930s, Karpis had acquired the reputation of being one of America's most wanted fugitives, and after other famous outlaws were captured or killed, his name increasingly stood alone. The gang was gone, but Alvin Karpis remained. That made him valuable to newspapers and important to the Bureau. Karpis understood something essential about being hunted. Sometimes, the most obvious way to disappear is not to hide in a cabin in the wilderness. It is to become ordinary, live in a city, wear ordinary clothes, drive an ordinary automobile, use another name, avoid attracting attention. The problem was his face. Wanted notices circulated, newspapers printed photographs, agents showed pictures to people connected with the investigation. Karpis could change his hairstyle, change clothing, use another identity, but he could not easily change the basic structure of his face. So, like several fugitives of the era, he reportedly sought ways to alter his appearance. One of the darker and stranger aspects of the public enemy era involved criminals attempting to change identifying features. Fingerprints were becoming increasingly dangerous to fugitives. Faces appeared on wanted posters. Scars could be listed in physical descriptions. Some criminals turned to underworld doctors, hoping medicine could defeat identification. Karpis became associated with Joseph Moran, a physician connected to members of the criminal underworld. Moran's name appears repeatedly in stories involving fugitives who sought medical assistance while avoiding legitimate institutions. For a wanted criminal, an ordinary hospital created risk, questions, names, records, police notification. An underworld physician offered discretion, but discretion came with its own dangers. Karpis reportedly underwent procedures intended to make identification more difficult. The idea itself reveals how dramatically policing had changed. A generation earlier, a false name in a different city might have been enough. Now criminals were considering alterations to their own bodies because federal records could follow them wherever they went. The fugitive was adapting because law enforcement had adapted. It was an arms race of identification. But there was a problem with trying to erase the past. It rarely disappeared completely. Fingerprints could be damaged, but damaged fingertips could themselves become suspicious. Faces could be altered. But photographs still existed. Aliases could change, but associates remained, and every doctor, every intermediary, every person trusted with the fugitive's identity created another possible path for investigators. once again. Karpis needed people in order to disappear, and needing people made disappearance more difficult. Federal agents continued pursuing leads. They examined Karpis's associates, followed suspected contacts, collected reports, compared sightings, investigated automobiles, and waited. Many leads went nowhere. Someone would report seeing Karpis in one city, while another person claimed he was hundreds of miles away. A famous fugitive generates false sightings. People become convinced they recognize a face from the newspaper. Investigators have to determine which reports matter and which are imagination. That takes time. Karpis benefited from the noise. Every false sighting consumed attention. Every dead end bought time. But he could not depend upon false leads forever. Eventually, someone would see the right person. Someone would recognize the right automobile. Someone would make the right connection. The Bureau only needed one lead to be correct. The hunt for Karpis also became intertwined with the public image of J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover was not merely running an investigative agency. He was building its reputation. The Bureau increasingly presented its agents as disciplined professionals, capable of defeating the interstate gangster. That image mattered politically. It mattered institutionally, and it mattered to Hoover personally. Karpis's continued freedom, therefore, became more than an unresolved criminal case. It became a challenge to the Bureau's public narrative. The longer the pursuit continued, the greater the pressure. Karpis later described Hoover in extremely unflattering terms. Hoover's version of events naturally differed, and when the two men's stories eventually intersected directly, the disagreement would become part of the legend. Who actually arrested Alvin Karpis? How personally involved was Hoover? Who approached the automobile? Who held a weapon? And then, the detail that became almost comical in later retellings. Did the agents really arrive to capture America's most wanted fugitive without handcuffs? Those questions belong later, because Karpis was not yet caught. He survived through the remainder of 1935, month after month, moving, watching, listening, avoiding. The people around him changed, the locations changed, the names changed, but the objective remained remarkably simple. Do not be found, and for more than a year after Fred Barker's death, he succeeded. That is worth emphasizing. By this point, Karpis was not an obscure local offender. Federal investigators knew exactly whom they wanted. His photograph circulated. His criminal relationships had been studied. The Bureau possessed fingerprints and records. The newspapers knew his name. And still, he remained free. But freedom for a hunted man is not the same as ordinary freedom. He could travel, but never entirely relax. He could enter a restaurant, but had to notice who was looking. He could rent a room, but had to consider what name to use. He could meet someone, but had to wonder whether that person was being watched. He could drive, but had to think about the automobile itself becoming recognizable. The country remained physically enormous. Psychologically, it was shrinking. Eventually, the trail moved south, Louisiana, New Orleans, a city filled with visitors, hotels, restaurants, crowded streets, automobiles, people arriving and leaving constantly, the kind of place where a stranger could blend in. For Karpis, it might have seemed like another temporary stop, another city, another automobile, another day spent beyond the reach of federal agents. But investigators were closer than he realized, and this time, they were not simply following another rumor. They knew where he was. May 1st, 1936. The date from our opening, Canal Street, New Orleans. Alvin Karpis approached an automobile nearby. Federal agents waited, and among them was J. Edgar Hoover. After more than a year as perhaps America's most notorious surviving Depression-era fugitive, Karpis's extraordinary run was about to end, but the arrest itself would produce two completely different stories, one told by the Bureau and one told by Alvin Karpis. May 1st, 1936, New Orleans, Louisiana. For more than a year, Alvin Karpis had remained free. Fred Barker was dead. Ma Barker was dead. Arthur Barker was in prison. The Barker-Karpis Gang, as it had once existed, was gone. Yet Karpis continued moving, continued using aliases, continued avoiding capture. Federal agents had followed leads across the country. They had questioned associates, watched addresses, tracked automobiles, investigated sightings, and waited for the mistake that would finally bring them close enough. Now, they believed that moment had arrived. New Orleans offered many of the qualities a fugitive might want. It was busy, transient, filled with visitors. Hotels received strangers every day. Railroads connected the city with the rest of the country. Automobiles moved constantly through crowded streets. A man using another name could disappear among thousands of people who had no reason to examine him closely. But by 1936, Karpis's problem was no longer simply finding somewhere to hide. He was famous. His face had appeared in newspapers. Wanted information circulated among law enforcement agencies. Federal investigators knew his associates, and wherever Karpis went, he needed other people. That was the weakness investigators had been exploiting for years. Eventually, information brought agents to New Orleans. They identified Karpis's location, and rather than simply ordering agents in the area to make the arrest, J. Edgar Hoover traveled south. That decision would become one of the most discussed aspects of the entire case. By 1936, Hoover had spent more than a decade building the Federal Bureau into a modern national investigative organization. The institution had recently acquired the name by which it would become famous, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Hoover understood publicity extraordinarily well. The capture of famous gangsters helped demonstrate the Bureau's effectiveness. Agents were presented as professional, disciplined, scientific, and relentless. The gangster might have a fast automobile. The FBI had fingerprints, records, coordination, and time. Karpis represented one of the final great trophies of the public enemy era. Hoover wanted to be there. That decision is important because Hoover was primarily an administrator. He was not ordinarily traveling around America, personally arresting fugitives. Yet in New Orleans, the director of the FBI placed himself at the scene. Why? The answer depends partly upon whose version of events we believe. Karpis was traveling with an associate named Fred Hunter. On the afternoon of May 1st, they approached their automobile. Federal agents were nearby. The operation had been carefully prepared. Karpis did not know that the ordinary-looking street around him had become a trap. Agents moved in. Weapons were drawn. The fugitive who had survived one of the most intensive manhunts in America was suddenly surrounded. There was nowhere useful to run, no highway yet, no second automobile, no hidden exit, no Fred Barker beside him. The pursuit that had lasted years ended in moments. Alvin Karpis surrendered, and then, according to one of the most famous stories about the arrest, Everyone discovered a problem. No handcuffs. The story has been repeated endlessly. Federal agents finally capture America's most wanted fugitive, only to realize that nobody brought handcuffs. In some versions, Karpis was restrained using a necktie. It's almost too perfect, the kind of detail that turns history into legend. But the accounts of the arrest do not agree neatly. Karpis later gave his own description of what happened. The Bureau promoted another, and Hoover's personal role became particularly controversial. This is one of those moments where true crime history requires caution. A dramatic story can become famous precisely because it is dramatic. Each retelling reinforces the previous one. Eventually, the memorable version can become more familiar than the evidence beneath it. So, rather than pretending we know every second of the arrest with certainty, we can separate what is clear from what is disputed. Karpis was captured in New Orleans on May 1st, 1936. J. Edgar Hoover was present. Federal agents surrounded Karpis and took him into custody. The arrest occurred without the prolonged armed confrontation that had ended the lives of several other famous fugitives. Those facts are well established. Exactly who did what, who approached first, and how dramatically Hoover personally participated became subjects of competing accounts. Years later, Karpis was deeply dismissive of Hoover's reputation. He portrayed the FBI director as someone eager to receive public credit, but much less eager to expose himself to actual danger. In Karpis' telling, Hoover's role in the arrest was less heroic than the public version suggested. That does not automatically make Karpis correct. He had obvious reasons to dislike Hoover. He had spent decades in federal custody. He was describing events long afterward. Memory changes. Resentment shapes recollection. But the same caution applies to institutional publicity. The FBI had reasons to portray Hoover favorably. So we are left with two interested narrators, the captured criminal and the agency that captured him. Neither should necessarily be treated as perfectly neutral, and that tension makes the story much more interesting, because the arrest was not merely the end of a manhunt. It became a contest over who would control the story afterward. For Hoover, the arrest offered an extraordinary publicity opportunity. Here was the director of the FBI, personally present when one of America's most notorious fugitives was captured. Newspapers could report it. Photographs could circulate. The Bureau could present Karpis' arrest as evidence that the age of the interstate gangster was ending. No matter how fast they drove, no matter how many aliases they used, no matter how many state lines they crossed, eventually, federal law enforcement would find them. That was the message. And Alvin Karpis was an ideal symbol. Only a few years earlier, the public enemy era had seemed almost uncontrollable. Dillinger escaped. Bonnie and Clyde crossed state lines. Pretty Boy Floyd disappeared into rural communities. Babyface Nelson fought pursuing agents. The Barker-Karpis Gang kidnapped wealthy businessmen and collected enormous ransoms. But by May 1936, most of those figures were dead or imprisoned. Karpis' arrest looked like the closing scene of an era. Newspapers frequently described Karpis as public enemy number one. That phrase has followed him ever since. But as we discussed earlier, it is useful to be cautious with the title. Popular culture sometimes imagines an official FBI list with criminals neatly ranked. Number 1, number 2, number 3. That is not quite how the term functioned. public enemy language had circulated through newspapers and law enforcement for years. It was part designation, part publicity, part mythology. Still, by the time Karpis was captured, he had become one of the most prominent surviving fugitives of the Depression-era crime wave. Whether or not a literal numbered list existed, the symbolism was real. Karpis was the man the FBI wanted the public to know it had finally caught. The transition must have been extraordinary. One moment, Karpis controlled where he went, not completely. A fugitive is never entirely free, but he chose the road, the city, the hotel, the automobile, the alias. Then, suddenly, other people controlled everything, where he stood, where he sat, where he traveled, who could speak to him, where he would sleep. After years of movement, Karpis had stopped, and he would not regain ordinary freedom for more than 3 decades. Federal authorities transported him under heavy security. There would be no casual opportunity to escape, no overlooked door, no sympathetic associate waiting nearby. The government had spent too long searching for him. They were not going to lose him now. Karpis's past was waiting. Edward Bremer had been released more than 2 years earlier, but the kidnapping had never gone away. The evidence remained. The investigation remained. The federal charges remained. Now, the government finally had Alvin Karpis in custody. The manhunt was finished. The prosecution could begin, and Karpis understood the stakes. Kidnapping under federal law carried severe punishment. His associates had already fallen. Arthur Barker had been convicted. Karpis could see where the road was leading. Not back to Kansas, not back to St. Paul, not to another hideout, not to another rented house. Prison. And given his history, probably one of the most secure prisons available. Karpis's capture also distinguishes him from many of the famous criminals around him. He survived it. That sounds simple, but look at the list. John Dillinger did not survive his final encounter with federal agents. Pretty Boy Floyd did not. Babyface Nelson did not. Bonnie and Clyde did not survive their ambush by law enforcement. Fred Barker did not survive the Florida confrontation. Ma Barker did not either. Karpis did. That single fact changed his historical importance, because decades later, he could speak. He could remember. He could dispute. He could tell journalists and writers, that's not how it happened. His recollections would become one of the most valuable and sometimes controversial sources for understanding the Barker-Karpis Gang. Without Karpis, much of the Ma Barker debate would look very different. The strange relationship between Karpis and Hoover did not end on Canal Street. In a sense, it had only just begun. Hoover had built part of the FBI's public reputation by pursuing criminals like Karpis. Karpis would later build part of his own public identity by criticizing Hoover and challenging the Bureau's version of history. Each man became part of the other story. One represented the expanding power of federal law enforcement. The other represented the fading world of the interstate outlaw. On May 1st, 1936, those two worlds physically met, and federal law enforcement won. For years, the road had been Karpis's greatest defense. Minnesota, Kansas, Illinois, Wisconsin, Florida, Louisiana. Cities and highways had allowed him to remain mobile. A police department might control a city, a sheriff might control a county, but Karpis could leave. Federal law enforcement changed that equation. State boundaries no longer offered the same protection. Criminal records followed him. Fingerprints followed him. Photographs followed him. Associates connected one city to another. Eventually, there was nowhere far enough away. The highway motif we've been following throughout this story ends here, not permanently. Karpis would travel again, but not by his own choice. From now on, his movements would be dictated by guards, court orders, prison transfers, federal authorities, and soon a boat. Because the government was preparing to send Alvin Karpis somewhere very different from New Orleans, somewhere without highways, somewhere without state lines, somewhere where changing automobiles would accomplish nothing. A small island in San Francisco Bay. But before Karpis reached Alcatraz, there would be a trial, a conviction, and the realization that the man who had spent years escaping confinement might never be free again. And when he finally arrived on the island, he would encounter something remarkable. Men whose names he already knew, men whose stories had appeared alongside his in newspapers, and eventually, even surviving pieces of his own criminal past. Alcatraz was becoming, in a strange way, a gathering place for the ghosts of the public enemy era, and Alvin Karpis would remain there longer than anyone else. May 1936, Alvin Karpis was no longer running. For years, his life had been measured in miles, different cities, different automobiles, different houses, different names. Now, the federal government controlled the destination. Karpis faced prosecution for his role in the kidnapping of Edward Bremer. The evidence that had followed him through years of flight could finally be presented against him, and the outcome would determine where he spent the next chapter of his life. Karpis pleaded guilty to the Bremer kidnapping. The sentence was severe, life imprisonment, for a man who had spent years avoiding confinement. Those words represented something almost unimaginable. Life, not 5 years, not 10, not a date he could circle on a calendar and wait for. Life. And federal authorities had a particular destination in mind, a prison that had opened only 2 years earlier, a prison created specifically for inmates considered difficult, dangerous, influential, or likely to escape. The same prison to which Arthur Barker had already been sent, Alcatraz. Karpis was transported across the country. The journey itself represented a complete reversal of his former life. Once, he chose the road. Now, guards chose it. Once, crossing a state line could help him escape an investigation. Now, state lines meant nothing. Once, a railway station offered another way to disappear. Now, transportation simply carried him closer to prison. Eventually, California, San Francisco, and then the Bay. A boat carried Karpis toward the island. From the water, Alcatraz rose from San Francisco Bay like a fortress. Concrete, rock, guard towers, fences, the cell house standing above everything. Behind him, San Francisco. Ahead, a place designed to prevent exactly what Karpis had spent much of his adult life doing, leaving. At Alcatraz, Alvin Karpis became prisoner AZ-325. The famous fugitive had been reduced to a number. That was deliberate. Alcatraz was built around control. The men sent there often arrived with enormous reputations. Gang leaders, bank robbers, kidnappers, racketeers, men whose names had appeared on front pages. But the institution did not care how dramatic the newspaper headlines had been. Inside, a celebrity criminal still had to stand for count, still had to follow orders, still had to return to his cell, still had to ask permission. Karpis entered an extraordinary population. Al Capone had been sent to Alcatraz. George Machine Gun Kelly was there. Other notorious prisoners would come and go. Men who had once dominated headlines now lived within a few hundred feet of one another. The prison became almost a museum of the public enemy era, except the exhibits were alive, and none of them were allowed to leave. For Karpis, one inmate carried particular significance. Arthur Barker, Fred's brother, his former associate, a surviving piece of the criminal world Karpis had left behind. Arthur had arrived at Alcatraz before him. For a brief period, two important figures from the Barker-Karpis organization were confined on the same island, but their reunion would not last. In January 1939, Arthur and 4 other inmates attempted to escape from the Model Industries building. They succeeded in getting outside, but they did not get off the island. Arthur was shot during the attempt and later died. For Karpis, another Barker was gone. Herman had died years earlier. Fred had died in Florida. Arthur was now dead at Alcatraz. The criminal network that once surrounded Karpis was becoming something that existed only in memory, and Karpis was still there. Days at Alcatraz were built around repetition. Wake, count, breakfast, work, count, meals, return to the cell, another count, lights out, again and again and again. The routine was intended to remove uncertainty. For guards, predictability meant security. For prisoners, predictability could become suffocating. One day resembled another. Weeks disappeared. Months disappeared. Years disappeared. Imagine what 26 years means in that environment. Not simply 26 winters or 26 birthdays, but thousands upon thousands of ordinary days. Meals eaten inside the institution, doors opening, doors closing, keys, footsteps, counts, work assignments, the same walls, the same bay, the same view of a city that continued changing without you. That may have been one of Alcatraz's strangest psychological features. Freedom was visible. San Francisco was not an abstract idea. It was across the water. Prisoners could see the mainland. At night, they could see lights. Boats moved through the bay. The city lived. People went to work. Children grew up. Couples married. Businesses opened and closed. Cars changed. Clothing changed. Music changed. Presidents changed. Wars began and ended. And from the island, Karpis watched time move forward. When Karpis arrived at Alcatraz in 1936, Franklin Roosevelt was president. The United States had not yet entered the Second World War. Television was not part of ordinary American life. Commercial air travel was still developing. Most American homes did not contain anything resembling the technology that would become commonplace by the 1960s. The world Karpis had known as a fugitive would disappear while he was incarcerated. 5 years after Karpis arrived, the United States entered World War II. Pearl Harbor, mobilization. Millions of Americans entered military service. Factories transformed. The country changed. Alcatraz remained. Karpis remained. The war ended. 1945. Still there. Then came the post-war years. New automobiles. New suburbs. Television. Rock and roll. The Cold War. The Korean War. A generation born after Karpis's capture grew toward adulthood. Still, he remained at Alcatraz. This is one of the details that makes his story so difficult to comprehend. Karpis entered the prison as a famous Depression-era gangster. By the time he left the island, the Depression-era gangster already belonged to history. Popular culture often imagines Alcatraz as a place where America's most famous criminals constantly interacted. Reality was more controlled. Prisoners could not simply socialize however they pleased. But over decades, Karpis inevitably encountered men whose names had become legendary. One of them was Robert Stroud, the man later known to the public as the Birdman of Alcatraz. The nickname itself is misleading. Stroud's famous work with birds occurred primarily before his transfer to Alcatraz. He was not permitted to keep birds there, but his reputation followed him to the island. Karpis knew Stroud and later wrote about him. His recollections were not particularly sentimental. That is another advantage Karpis gives us as a historical source. He did not experience Alcatraz as a visitor or a guard or a journalist. He lived there for decades. Alcatraz eventually became surrounded by mythology: the Rock, the impossible prison, America's worst criminals, escape attempts, fog, sharks, cold water. Hollywood amplified everything. But for Karpis, Alcatraz was not mythology. It was where he ate breakfast, where he worked, where he slept, where he aged. That distinction matters. The dramatic events make Alcatraz famous, but most prison life is not dramatic. It is repetitive. And repetition, over 26 years, becomes its own kind of story. Karpis found ways to occupy himself. One was music. He became interested in playing guitar. That detail offers an unusual contrast with the man newspapers had described as a public enemy. Inside prison, identity changes. The outside world knew Karpis as a kidnapper, a bank robber, a fugitive. But a person serving decades behind bars still has hours to fill, skills to learn, relationships to navigate, habits to develop. Whatever else Karpis was, he was also a human being confronting an enormous amount of time. And time, more than the bars, may have been Alcatraz's most powerful weapon. A prisoner could imagine defeating a lock. He could imagine climbing a fence. He could imagine swimming the bay, but there was no trick for defeating 26 years. They simply had to pass, naturally. Karpis knew about escape attempts. Arthur Barker had died during one. Other prisoners tried. Some plans failed almost immediately. Others progressed much further. Alcatraz authorities insisted that the island was extraordinarily secure. The water surrounding it provided a natural barrier. Cold temperatures, currents, distance. Even if someone escaped the cell house, the bay remained, yet prisoners continued trying. That tells us something important. When a man believes he may spend the rest of his life behind bars, even an extraordinarily dangerous possibility can begin to look like hope. Karpis did not escape. Instead, he endured year after year. That ultimately makes his Alcatraz story unusual. He did not become famous there because of one spectacular incident. He became remarkable because he stayed. Alvin Karpis ultimately spent approximately 26 years at Alcatraz, more time there than any other federal prisoner. Think about some of the names more strongly associated with the island: Al Capone, Machine Gun Kelly, Robert Stroud, Frank Morris, the Anglin brothers. Yet none spent as many years confined there as Alvin Karpis. He watched inmates arrive. He watched inmates leave. He watched policies change. Guards changed. Administrators changed. The outside world changed. Karpis remained. By the late 1950s, he was no longer the young fugitive captured in New Orleans. His face had aged. His hair had changed. The newspapers no longer treated him as breaking news. A younger generation might barely recognize his name. The FBI's famous public enemy had become an aging prisoner, and perhaps that was the greatest transformation of all. Not the arrest, not the sentence, time. Then, something happened that would eventually become the most famous event in Alcatraz history. 3 prisoners disappeared: Frank Morris, John Anglin, Clarence Anglin. They had prepared an elaborate escape. They created dummy heads, worked through openings behind their cells, reached utility spaces, climbed upward, and disappeared into the night. Authorities concluded that the men most likely did not survive the crossing, but definitive proof of their fate never emerged. The mystery remains famous today. Karpis was still at Alcatraz when they vanished, a man whose criminal career had begun in the 1920s, was present during an escape attempt that people would still be debating in the 21st century. His incarceration had stretched across eras. Later that year, 1962, Alvin Karpis finally left Alcatraz, not because he had escaped, not because he had completed his life sentence. He was transferred to another federal institution after approximately 26 years. His time on the island was over. Imagine that boat ride, the same bay, the same city, but almost nothing else was the same. The man arriving in 1936 had belonged to a world of fedoras, road maps, bank robberies, ransom notes, and Depression-era headlines. The man leaving in 1962 entered an America of jet aircraft, television, interstate highways, and the beginnings of the space age. The world had moved forward without him, yet, remarkably, Karpis' story still was not finished, because unlike Arthur Barker, unlike Fred Barker, unlike so many of the famous criminals of his generation, Alvin Karpis would eventually walk out of prison alive. After more than 3 decades in custody, the former public enemy would regain his freedom, and then he would begin talking about Fred, about Arthur, about Ma Barker, about Hoover, about Alcatraz, about the crimes, about the arrests, and about the mythology that had grown around all of them. The man who had spent decades being written about would finally have the opportunity to write himself back into the story. 1962, Alvin Karpis left Alcatraz. For 26 years, the island had been his home. He had arrived in 1936. At the end of the great public enemy era, he left during the presidency of John F. Kennedy. The difference between those two Americas was enormous. When Karpis entered Alcatraz, television was an experimental technology. Commercial aviation was still young. There were no interstate highways crossing the country. World War II had not yet begun. The atomic age had not yet arrived. Human beings had never traveled into space. By the time he left, all of those things had changed, and so had Alvin Karpis. There was no dramatic escape, no tunnel, no raft, no midnight swim through San Francisco Bay. Karpis simply received orders transferring him away from the island. After more than a quarter century, he was taken back across the water. The skyline he had looked toward for decades was suddenly closer, but he was not free. Alcatraz was merely one prison within the federal system. Karpis still had a life sentence. He was transferred to the federal penitentiary at McNeil Island in Washington state. One island for another. There must have been something strange about leaving Alcatraz after so long. Prisoners often imagine release, but Karpis was not being released. The routines would continue. Counts, guards, rules, locked doors. The difference was simply geography. Yet even geography mattered. Alcatraz had defined his existence for 26 years. Every wall had become familiar, every sound recognizable, every routine predictable. Leaving meant entering another unfamiliar environment. As an aging man at McNeil Island, Karpis encountered a very different generation of American criminal history. Among the prisoners there during the 1960s was a young man named Charles Manson. At the time, Manson was not yet the infamous figure he would later become. The crimes that made his name internationally notorious were still years away. He was simply another federal prisoner, and remarkably, Alvin Karpis later recalled knowing him. According to Karpis, Manson wanted to learn to play guitar. Karpis had spent years developing his own musical ability while incarcerated, and he reportedly gave the younger prisoner some instruction. It is one of those historical intersections that sounds almost invented. A man associated with the great gangster era of the 1930s, teaching guitar to someone whose name would become synonymous with an entirely different era of American crime. Two generations, two completely different worlds, briefly overlapping, inside the same prison. Karpis later described Manson as unusual, but there was no way he could have known what the younger man would eventually become. That future belonged to the outside world, and Karpis was still waiting for his own opportunity to return to it. By the mid-1960s, Karpis had spent approximately 3 decades in federal custody. Think about the scale of that. A child born around the time of his arrest could now have children of their own. People who remembered the Bremer kidnapping as breaking news were middle-aged or elderly. The cars Karpis once used as getaway vehicles had become antiques. The criminal techniques that had once made the Barker-Karpis Gang difficult to pursue belonged to another age. The world had not simply changed, it had replaced itself. Karpis had entered federal custody at 28 years old. He was approaching 60. His entire middle adulthood had happened inside institutions. That creates a problem beyond imprisonment itself. How does someone return to ordinary life when ordinary life has transformed beyond recognition? Finally, in 1969, the decision came after approximately 33 years in federal custody. Alvin Karpis was released. The man captured in New Orleans in 1936 was free, but there was a complication. Karpis had been born in Canada. He was not an American citizen. So his release did not mean simply walking out of prison and choosing an American city in which to begin again. Instead, he was deported back to Canada. It created a strange symmetry. Karpis's life had begun in Canada, in Montreal, more than 60 years earlier. As a child, he had moved with his family into the United States. There, he grew up, entered crime, went to prison, met Fred Barker, escaped, robbed banks, participated in kidnappings, became a fugitive, was captured, and spent 33 years incarcerated. Now, after all of it, the United States sent him back across the border. The Canada Karpis entered in 1969 was no more familiar than the America he had left behind. Modern cities, television, jet aircraft, new music, new slang, new social expectations, new technology, even handling ordinary daily life required adjustment. The world had developed habits, systems, and assumptions that Karpis had never needed to learn. Imagine walking into a modern supermarket after decades in prison, or seeing highways filled with automobiles unlike anything from the 1930s, watching television regularly, using new household appliances, encountering people who knew the Depression only from history books. For everyone else, those changes had happened gradually. For Karpis, They arrived almost at once. That phrase describes Karpis particularly well, a man out of time. His name belonged to another era. Ma Barker, Fred Barker, J. Edgar Hoover, Public Enemy Number 1, Alcatraz. To younger people, these were historical names. To Karpis, they were memories. He had known Fred. He had lived with Kate Barker. He had been arrested while Hoover stood nearby. He had occupied a cell at Alcatraz. The legends people consumed as entertainment had been his actual life, and now people wanted him to talk about it. For decades, other people had controlled the narrative. The FBI wrote reports, newspapers wrote stories, prosecutors described crimes, authors wrote books, Hollywood transformed gangsters into characters, and the Barker family acquired a mythology far larger than the people themselves. Karpis had spent most of that time behind bars. He had very little ability to participate in the public conversation. After his release, that changed. Karpis began telling his own story, and he had plenty to say. Perhaps most significantly, he attacked the legend of Ma Barker. By then, Kate Barker's image as a ruthless criminal mastermind had become deeply embedded in popular culture. The story was irresistible. An older mother commanding a gang of violent sons, a criminal matriarch, the supposed brains behind the Barker operation. But Karpis insisted that was not the woman he knew. Karpis did not portray Kate Barker as innocent. He did not claim she believed her sons were ordinary businessmen. She lived around criminals. She traveled with them. She benefited from their money. She protected her sons. But according to Karpis, she did not plan their crimes. She was not the strategist. She was not giving Fred and Alvin instructions about how to conduct kidnappings. And she was not the criminal mastermind later depicted in films and books. Karpis's explanation was practical. In his account, the men did not include Kate in detailed discussions because they did not regard her as part of the operational side of the gang. She was their companion, their mother, sometimes useful as part of the appearance of an ordinary household, but not the boss. This directly contradicted one of the most famous stories associated with the Barker-Karpis gang, and Karpis was uniquely positioned to challenge it. He had been there. Of course, being there does not make a witness infallible. Karpis had his own interests, his own loyalties, his own resentments, his own memories. Decades had passed. He may have minimized some things, misremembered others. Every memoir requires caution, but his account could not simply be dismissed. If anyone knew how the Barker-Karpis gang actually operated, Alvin Karpis was among the very small number of people qualified to say Karpis was equally willing to challenge another powerful legend. J. Edgar Hoover, he had little affection for the FBI director, and his later descriptions of Hoover were often deeply critical. The New Orleans arrest became a particular point of dispute. The Bureau's public image emphasized Hoover's presence at the capture. Karpis portrayed events differently, suggesting that Hoover's personal bravery had been greatly exaggerated. Once again, the truth sits inside competing narratives. The FBI had institutional reasons to make Hoover look heroic. Karpis had personal reasons to make him look ridiculous. The historian's job is not simply to choose whichever version is more entertaining. It is to recognize the interests behind both. Karpis eventually collaborated on accounts of his life. One of the best known was the Alvin Karpis story. Later came On the Rock, which focused heavily on his years at Alcatraz. These works gave readers something unusual. Not an FBI description of Karpis, not a newspaper profile, not a Hollywood gangster. Karpis. Describing Karpis. That does not make the books objective. Autobiographies almost never are. People explain themselves. They justify decisions. They emphasize certain memories. They minimize others. They settle old arguments. They sometimes reshape the past into a story that makes more sense in hindsight. Karpis was no exception, but even a biased memoir can be historically valuable, especially when the author knew people who could no longer speak for themselves. Fred Barker was dead. Arthur Barker was dead. Kate Barker was dead. Many agents and associates were gone. Karpis had become one of the last surviving voices from that world. Eventually, Karpis left Canada. He spent part of his later life in Europe, including Spain. It was an extraordinary final destination for someone whose adult life had once been defined by Midwestern highways and American federal prisons. The fugitive, who had once struggled to move from state to state without detection, could now cross an ocean legally. No nationwide manhunt, no wanted poster, no FBI agents waiting outside, no alias required. There is an irony in that. As a young man, Karpis traveled constantly because he was not free to remain anywhere. As an older man, he could travel because he finally was. But freedom arrived only after most of his life had already passed. By the 1970s, Karpis occupied an unusual position. He was no longer a public enemy. He was a historical figure. Journalists could interview him. Authors could ask questions. Readers wanted stories about Alcatraz, about the Barkers, about Hoover, about kidnapping, about the gangster era. The very notoriety that had once helped send federal agents after him now made people interested in hearing him speak. But there was a danger in that transformation. Criminals can become more appealing as history becomes distant. The photographs become stylish. The cars become beautiful antiques. The clothes become fashionable again. The names become characters. The violence becomes abstract, and the victims can disappear. That is something worth remembering when listening to Karpis describe his past. His life was extraordinary, but the crimes were real. William Hamm was abducted. Edward Bremer was held for weeks. Families were terrorized. People were threatened. Money was taken. Karpis's survival does not erase those realities. Still, his longevity gave him something almost none of his famous contemporaries possessed. Perspective. John Dillinger died at 31, Pretty Boy Floyd at 30, Babyface Nelson at 25. Fred Barker was 32. Arthur Barker died at 39. Karpis lived decades beyond all of them. He saw their names become legends. He saw books written, movies produced, historical narratives solidified. And then he had the opportunity to say, "You got some of it wrong." That makes Alvin Karpis valuable and complicated. He is both a subject of history and one of its sources. The man we are trying to understand is also one of the people telling us how we should understand him. And those two roles cannot be completely separated. Karpis spent his later years largely outside the United States. The world that had once hunted him had moved on. The FBI had changed. Alcatraz had closed. The Barker-Karpis Gang belonged to museums, archives, books, and old photographs. The public enemy era was history. Karpis, somehow, was still alive, but not forever. In 1979, in Spain, Alvin Karpis died. He was 72 years old. More than 4 decades had passed since his capture in New Orleans, and nearly half a century since he and Fred Barker had emerged as one of America's most notorious criminal partnerships. His death ended the life, but it did not settle the story, because Karpis had left something behind that Fred Barker never could, Arthur Barker never could, and Kate Barker never could, his version. And that creates one final question. When we reconstruct the Barker-Karpis gang today, how much of what we believe comes from evidence? How much comes from FBI publicity? How much comes from newspapers? And how much comes from Alvin Karpis himself? That is where we'll end our story. Not with another robbery, not with another prison, not with another arrest, but with the much harder problem of separating a man from his legend. Alvin Karpis died in 1979, but by then, the world that had made him famous had been gone for decades. The Barker-Karpis gang was gone. Fred Barker was gone. Arthur Barker was gone. Ma Barker was gone. Alcatraz had closed. J. Edgar Hoover was dead, and the Great Depression-era manhunts had become history. Yet the stories remained, and perhaps no surviving member of that world did more to complicate those stories than Alvin Karpis himself. Even today, Karpis is frequently described by one particular title, Public Enemy Number 1. Sometimes he is described as the final man to hold it. It's an irresistible phrase, dramatic, simple, memorable. It suggests an official hierarchy, with one criminal sitting at the very top. But history is rarely that tidy. The phrase, public enemy, had been used broadly during the gangster era. Newspapers embraced it. Law enforcement officials used similar language, and individual fugitives were sometimes elevated above the others in public attention. But the popular image of a precise, permanent FBI ranking system is misleading. What is true is that by 1936, Karpis occupied an unusual position. Many of the most famous fugitives of the era were already gone. John Dillinger was dead. Pretty Boy Floyd was dead. Babyface Nelson was dead. Bonnie and Clyde were dead. Fred Barker was dead. Arthur Barker was imprisoned. Karpis remained free. That made him enormously important to federal authorities. So whether or not we imagine a literal list, the symbolic meaning of his capture remains. He was one of the last major fugitives left over from the great public enemy era. And when he was captured, the age of the nationally celebrated interstate gangster was effectively coming to an end. Then there is J. Edgar Hoover. The photograph of Hoover associated with Karpis's arrest helped create a powerful image. The FBI director, personally participating in the capture of America's most notorious remaining fugitive. It was perfect publicity, but Karpis spent his later years attacking that version of events. In his telling, Hoover's participation was considerably less heroic. The two accounts cannot simply be blended together, and both sides had reasons to shape the story. Hoover had an institution to promote. Karpis had an old enemy to diminish. Perhaps the most responsible conclusion is also the least cinematic. Hoover was there. Karpis was captured. Federal agents carried out the operation. But exactly how much personal danger Hoover faced, and how central he was during those few moments, became entangled with publicity and memory. Sometimes, history does not give us a perfectly framed final answer, and admitting that is better than choosing the most dramatic version simply because it makes a better story. Even the famous handcuff story illustrates the problem. Agents capture Alvin Karpis, then discover that nobody has handcuffs. A necktie supposedly becomes the solution. It is funny, memorable, almost cinematic, which is precisely why we should be careful. Details like that survive because people enjoy repeating them, and after enough repetition, the story can begin to feel more certain than the evidence supporting it. That does not necessarily mean it never happened. It means we should distinguish between documented history and historical folklore. The Alvin Karpis story contains plenty of both, but no part of Karpis's legacy is more important than his challenge to the legend of Ma Barker. Kate Barker became far more famous in death than she had ever been in life. The story told about her was extraordinary. An older woman commanding a gang of criminal sons, planning robberies, directing kidnappings, running one of America's most notorious criminal organizations. She became the archetypal gangster mother. The image spread far beyond newspaper reports. Books repeated it, movies exaggerated it, television embraced it. Fictional criminal mothers were inspired by it. Eventually, Ma Barker became almost a character type. The name itself suggested a particular image: tough, controlling, ruthless, criminal. But Karpis said that woman never existed, at least, not in the form popular culture remembered her. According to Karpis, Kate Barker was fiercely loyal to her sons. She knew they were criminals. She traveled with them. She enjoyed the money their crimes produced. She could help make a rented house appear like an ordinary family home, but she was not the mastermind. Karpis's argument was essentially this: why would experienced criminals planning serious robberies and kidnappings place an older woman with no particular criminal expertise in command? In his telling, they didn't. This does not transform Kate Barker into an innocent bystander. Knowing that your sons are wanted criminals, traveling with them, living from their proceeds, and helping maintain their domestic arrangements are significant facts, but they are not the same thing as planning the Bremer kidnapping. That distinction has become increasingly important in modern discussions of Ma Barker, and much of the reason we question the traditional story at all is Alvin Karpis. But that creates another problem. How much should we trust him? Karpis was there. That makes his testimony enormously valuable. But being present does not make someone neutral. He had loyalties, resentments, pride, regrets, personal interpretations, and decades in which memories could change. He might remember some conversations vividly and others incorrectly. He might minimize his own responsibility. He might exaggerate another person's flaws. He might unconsciously reshape events the way all human beings sometimes do. And Karpis was telling stories people wanted to hear. That matters too. By the time his memoirs appeared, Alcatraz had become legendary. Ma Barker had become legendary. Hoover had become controversial. The gangster era had become entertainment. There was an audience for the last surviving outlaw, willing to reveal what really happened. Karpis occupied that role perfectly, so his memoirs should not be treated as unquestionable truth. But neither should FBI publicity, nor newspaper reporting, nor Hollywood. Instead, we compare them, and somewhere between those competing versions, a more complicated history begins to emerge. Even the gang's name deserves another look: the Barker-Karpis Gang. It sounds permanent, organized, almost corporate, but as we've seen, the reality was fluid. Karpis and Fred Barker formed the core partnership, Other criminals moved in and out. Arthur Barker participated in important crimes. Associates supplied vehicles, hideouts, information, and specialized skills. Kate Barker traveled with members of the group, but her operational role remains disputed. The gang was not one fixed collection of people. It was a network, and that helps explain both its success and its destruction. Networks made the gang flexible. They also gave investigators connections to follow. Every associate could become a lead. Every rented house could reveal another address. Every automobile could connect people. Every ransom bill could move through someone's hands. Every fingerprint could connect a suspect to evidence. The very relationships that allowed the gang to function eventually helped authorities dismantle it. Karpis's career also sits at a fascinating point in the history of policing. He belonged to one of the last generations of criminals who could exploit enormous gaps between local jurisdictions, drive quickly enough, cross enough boundaries, use enough names, and law enforcement might struggle to keep up. But that world was disappearing. The federal government was expanding. Records were becoming centralized. Fingerprints could identify people independent of aliases. Photographs circulated widely. Law enforcement agencies communicated more effectively. Federal statutes gave investigators greater ability to pursue interstate crimes. The automobile had initially helped create criminals like Karpis. Federal coordination helped destroy them. That makes his story larger than one gangster. It is partly the story of America becoming more connected. The same technology that allowed a criminal to travel farther eventually allowed information about him to travel farther too. And information ultimately moved faster. There is another irony. Karpis survived as a fugitive, partly by avoiding attention. Yet the crimes that made him wealthy made anonymity impossible. The Hamm kidnapping, the Bremer kidnapping, the Barker connection, the manhunt. Each success increased his notoriety. And notoriety is poisonous to a fugitive. The better known Karpis became, the fewer places he could safely exist. Eventually, the entire country became dangerous. A waiter could recognize him. A hotel employee could recognize him. A police officer could recognize him. A stranger reading the morning newspaper could recognize him. Fame turned America into a smaller place. And then, the government made his world physically smaller. A country became an island. An island became a cell. For 26 years, that remains one of the most extraordinary facts of his life. Alvin Karpis spent more time imprisoned at Alcatraz than any other federal inmate held there. Not Al Capone, not Machine Gun Kelly, not Robert Stroud, Karpis. The man remembered for movement, spent more than a quarter century on a rock, measuring only a fraction of a square mile, yet he survived it. He watched the Depression end, World War II begin and end, the atomic age arrive, television spread into American homes, the Korean War, the early Cold War, rock and roll, the beginning of the space age, and finally, the famous 1962 escape of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers. Karpis remained through almost the entire federal history of Alcatraz. Then, he left. Perhaps survival is the most unusual feature of Alvin Karpis' story. Not escape, survival. He survived the gangster era. He survived the manhunt. He survived capture. He survived his sentence. He survived Alcatraz. He survived long enough to be released. And he survived long enough to become old. That was something many of his contemporaries never experienced. Fred Barker never grew old. Arthur Barker never grew old. Dillinger never grew old. Floyd never grew old. Nelson never grew old. The mythology surrounding Depression-era criminals is partly frozen in youth because so many died young. Karpis did not. He had to experience what came afterward: aging, prison, release, obscurity, memory, and the strange experience of watching your own life become history. But before we allow Karpis's longevity to become romantic, we should return to the people whose experiences made his notoriety possible: William Hamm, Edward Bremer, their families, bank employees, witnesses, communities affected by the gang's crimes. The criminal gets the nickname, the wanted poster, the mug shot, the movie. The victim often receives far less attention. That imbalance is one of the challenges of telling historical true crime. Karpis is fascinating. That does not make his crimes admirable. The Barker-Karpis Gang was effective, but its effectiveness depended upon frightening and exploiting other people. Those realities belong in the story too. Look at a photograph of Alvin Karpis from the 1930s, and it is easy to see only the gangster, the face on the wanted notice, the fugitive, the public enemy. But photographs freeze people. Lives do not. That young man would become an Alcatraz prisoner, a middle-aged inmate, an older man adjusting to freedom, an expatriate, a memoirist, a historical witness. The person changed, even while the photograph remained the same. Perhaps that is why Karpis's story is so compelling. It refuses to end where gangster stories usually end. There is no final shootout, no young outlaw frozen permanently in newspaper mythology. Instead, there are decades afterward, consequences, time, and memory. Consider the distance his life covered: Montreal, Kansas, prison, the Midwest, St. Paul, kidnappings, highways, hideouts, New Orleans, federal custody, San Francisco Bay, Alcatraz, McNeil Island, Canada again, and finally, Europe. A life that once seemed destined to end violently on an American highway, instead ended decades later in Spain. And when Karpis died, the last chapter of his story remained unresolved in one important sense: not what happened to him. We know that. But who was he? Was he the calculating public enemy described by federal authorities? The loyal partner Karpis described in his own memoirs? The hardened criminal? The aging prisoner? The historical witness? The storyteller? The answer is probably all of them. History rarely gives us people who fit perfectly into one role. Alvin Karpis committed serious crimes. He also witnessed an extraordinary period of American history. He participated in events, then survived long enough to dispute how those events were remembered. That makes him valuable to historians, but it also makes him difficult, because sometimes the person who gives us the most information is also the person whose version requires the most careful examination. At the beginning of this story, we imagined Alvin Karpis on the road, a dark automobile, an empty highway, telephone poles disappearing toward the horizon. Movement was his protection. Keep driving, change cities, change names, never stay anywhere long enough to be found. For years, it worked. Then the road narrowed, associates disappeared, hideouts became dangerous, photographs circulated, federal agents closed in, until finally, on May 1st, 1936, the road ended in New Orleans. Then came another journey, not measured in miles, but years. 1 year, 5, 10, 20, 26 years on Alcatraz, 33 years in federal custody, and eventually, freedom. By then, The highways were different, the cars were different, the country was different, and Alvin Karpis was different too. The gangster era had passed. The Barker-Karpis Gang had become history. Ma Barker had become a legend. Alcatraz had become a tourist destination, and the fugitive once hunted across America had become one of the people historians relied upon to explain what that vanished world had actually been like. Whether every word he told us was true, we may never know, but without Alvin Karpis, we would understand that world differently, and perhaps that is his strangest legacy of all. The man who spent years trying not to leave a trace ultimately became one of the people who left behind the most detailed account. And that is where the story of Alvin Karpis ends. Thank you for joining me for another episode of ASMR Crime Chronicles. Tonight, we followed the extraordinary life of Alvin Karpis, from his childhood in Canada to the prisons of Kansas, his partnership with Fred Barker, the rise of the Barker-Karpis Gang, the kidnappings of William Hamm and Edward Bremer, the collapse of the gang, and the nationwide manhunt that finally ended on a street in New Orleans. We followed him to Alcatraz, where the man who had spent years constantly moving would remain for more than a quarter of a century. And finally, we followed him back into a world that had changed almost beyond recognition, where he became one of the last surviving voices of America's public enemy era. If you enjoyed this longer, more detailed format, please let me know in the comments. I've really enjoyed being able to slow these stories down, explore the history surrounding the cases, and spend more time with the details that shorter episodes sometimes have to leave behind. If you haven't already, please consider liking the video and subscribing to ASMR Crime Chronicles. Every new subscriber helps this little channel grow, and I'm very grateful to everyone who chooses to spend some quiet time here with me. And if there's a case, a mystery, or a forgotten piece of true crime history you'd like us to explore next, please leave your suggestion in the comments. Until next time, stay safe, take care of yourselves, and thank you for listening. Good night.